My girlfriend said, "You're nothing special and easily replaceable." I agreed quietly and walked away without drama. Months later, she watched from a distance as I became everything she said I wasn't. "You know what your problem is? You're nothing special. And honestly, you're the most replaceable person I've ever been with." She said it like it was obvious, like it was a thing I should have already known about myself and had simply forgotten to acknowledge. She didn't yell it. She didn't launch it across the room in the middle of a fight. She said it the way you'd read the morning weather forecast, flat, certain, done, like a fact that had been waiting to be spoken aloud and had finally grown tired of waiting. And I just stood there. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for a defense or beg her to take it back or ask her what she meant. I looked at her for a long moment, and something inside me, something I didn't have a name for yet, went very, very quiet. "Yeah," I said, "you're probably right." And then I walked out. No slam of the door. No dramatic exit speech. No final words engineered to wound her on the way through. I picked up my jacket from the chair, took my keys from the counter where I always left them, and I walked out into the night air like someone leaving a meeting that had run too long. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that those words, her words, were about to become the most useful thing anyone had ever said to me. Not because she was right, but because she was wrong in exactly the way I needed to hear. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. Not slowly, not gently, all at once, like a window shattering inward, the kind where the glass holds its shape for one silent second before collapsing into the room. Because here's what I actually had when she said those words. I had a job I had been coasting through for almost 2 years. Not failing, coasting. The kind of professional existence where you show up, do what's asked, leave on time, collect a decent paycheck, and convince yourself that stability is the same thing as progress. I had a routine that had slowly calcified around me. Same route to work, same lunch, same evenings folded into the shape of the relationship, which had become its own kind of routine, one I no longer examined, just performed. I had a version of myself I had quietly shrunk down to fit inside a relationship that never once asked me to grow, only to accommodate. And I had adapted to that. I had bent myself smaller, year by year, adjustment by adjustment, until I couldn't remember what the original shape of me looked like. Couldn't remember what I had been like before I learned to monitor every word before I said it. Before I stopped taking up space. She was right that I wasn't much in that moment. What she missed completely was why. And something irreversible had already started the second I stepped out her door. I just couldn't feel it yet. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. For context, I was 26. We had been together for 2 years and 4 months. I worked in operations at a logistics company. She was in marketing. That's all the background you need. The rest of it will come through in what happened. The relationship had been deteriorating for a long time before that night. I see that clearly now. From a distance, with the benefit of everything that came after, it's obvious. But inside it, inside the daily texture of it, I kept misreading the signals. I kept attributing things to circumstance rather than character. I kept telling myself we were both stressed, both stretched thin, both just going through a rough stretch that would smooth out once life got quieter. I was wrong about all of it. There was a version of her I had genuinely fallen for at the beginning. She was sharp, funny in this dry, unexpected way that caught you off guard. She had opinions she wasn't shy about. She challenged me in conversations, pushed back on things I said, made me think differently about topics I thought I had already settled in my own head. I liked that about her. I had been drawn to it specifically, but at some point, I still cannot pinpoint exactly when, the quality of that sharpness changed. The challenges became criticisms. The pushback became contempt. She wasn't challenging me to expand anymore. She was diminishing me, and the slow drift from one to the other was so gradual that by the time I noticed it fully, I'd already been reshaped by it for months. Here's the thing about that kind of gradual erosion. You adapt. You learn the new rules without anyone announcing them. You start measuring yourself before you speak. Is this going to start something? Is this going to cause a problem tonight? You stop suggesting things, stop pitching ideas, stop expressing enthusiasm about things you care about, because enthusiasm had started to feel embarrassing around her, like something juvenile you should have grown out of. I thought I was being considerate. I was disappearing. And the part one I'm still working to fully understand is this. I let it happen. Not passively. Not without agency. I made choices, day after day, to keep the peace rather than hold the line. I chose accommodation over honesty, And I did it so consistently that I lost track of where accommodation ended and I began. That's not her fault exclusively. That's mine too. But there's a difference between accepting your share of the blame and accepting a verdict. Those are not the same thing. And for too long I had been confusing them. The night she said it, we weren't even fighting. That's the detail that keeps surfacing whenever I revisit it. There was no blow-up, no escalation, no chain of events that built toward explosion. We had eaten dinner together at her place, cleaned up in the easy, quiet way that comes with 2 years of shared routine. We were sitting in her living room. She was on her phone. I had said something. I genuinely cannot remember what. Something small and offhand. And she looked up with an expression I had seen before, but never let myself fully read. Tired. Bored. Like she was sitting in a waiting room she had been in too long. You know what your problem is? I thought it was going to be something small. Some domestic complaint. The kind of low-stakes criticism I had learned to absorb without visible reaction, because reacting visibly just made things longer and louder. But she put her phone down. She looked at me with an expression that was almost kind in its certainty. Like she was doing me a favor by finally being honest. Like she had been holding something back out of decency and had finally decided decency wasn't worth it. You're nothing special. And honestly, you're the most replaceable person I've ever been with. The silence after it was total. For exactly 1 second, I wanted to fight back. I wanted to list things. I wanted to lay out every time I had shown up for her. Every inconvenience I had quietly swallowed. Every moment I had put her needs ahead of my own without making a production of it. Every night I had been the steady presence she needed without receiving much of anything in return. I wanted to say, you don't actually see me. You've decided what I am and stopped looking. But I didn't. Because I looked at her face and understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't a conversation. This wasn't an opening in which we could examine something together. This was a verdict. A pronouncement delivered from a height she had been climbing toward for a long time. Delivered now that she had finally reached an altitude where she felt fully justified saying it out loud. You don't argue with verdicts. You either accept them or you leave. Yeah, I said. Quiet. Steady. You're probably right. She blinked. She had loaded herself up for impact. She had expected resistance, a fight, tears, pleas, anger, something to push against and escalate from. And suddenly there was nothing to hit. Just a man picking up his jacket, unhooking his keys, and heading for the door without any theater at all. I walked out. The first week was strange in ways I hadn't prepared for. Not the drowning grief I had braced myself to feel. Not the kind of sadness that pulls you under and holds you there. It was more like the feeling after a long fever finally breaks. Everything slightly too bright, slightly too sharp. Your body recalibrating. You're not sure if you feel better or just different. You're not sure what you are now, without the thing that was consuming so much of your energy. I went to work. I came home. I sat in my apartment in the evenings and let the silence exist without filling it. That was harder than it sounds. I had spent 2 years in a situation where quiet evenings were something to manage rather than rest in. Without that constant low-level vigilance, I didn't quite know what to do with the stillness. She texted once, about 4 days in. Short. So that's it. I read it. I set the phone down. I sat with it. I wasn't trying to punish her by not responding. I genuinely had nothing to say that was simultaneously honest and kind. There was no message I could write that was fair to both of us at once. So I said nothing. Nothing was the most honest thing available. The second week, something shifted. I couldn't sleep one night. Not anxiously, just awake. Lying in the dark with the ceiling above me and no particular thought demanding attention. And her words came back to me. Not to wound me. Not with the sting they might have carried a few nights earlier. Almost like a question waiting to be answered. Nothing special. Easily replaceable. I lay there and actually thought about it. Not defensively. Seriously. If those words were the negative, what was the positive? What would the opposite look like? If I were going to become someone I was genuinely proud of, what would that require? Not for her. Not in reaction to her. Just for myself, as a question worth answering. I didn't have a complete answer that night. Just the question. But a question is a direction. You start moving toward it before you even realize you're moving. I need to be honest about what I was actually working with. The version of me that walked out of her apartment that night was not someone you would have put money on. I had been coasting for close to 2 years, and the coasting had compounded. I had let my closest friendships go quiet. Not through any falling out. Just through the slow neglect that happens when a relationship becomes the entire center of your social gravity. You stop being a person with an independent orbit. You become a satellite, existing in relation to something else rather than from your own center. I had stopped going to the gym, which sounds small but wasn't. In my early 20s, I had genuinely loved training. Not obsessively, it wasn't my identity, but it had been mine. A space where I showed up, worked hard, and felt the specific satisfaction of doing something physically demanding and doing it consistently. I had let it go gradually over the course of the relationship, because the evenings had been absorbed by other things, and I had stopped protecting any time as my own. I had stopped reading for pleasure, stopped learning things out of curiosity, stopped being genuinely interested in ideas that didn't have immediate application to whatever I was trying to manage that week. I had become someone who existed primarily in reaction. React to the relationship, react to the job, react to whatever needed reacting to. No real initiative, no real direction of my own. Just response after response after response, and at the end of the day, nothing that actually came from me. The most damaging part of all of it was that I had called it maturity. I had told myself I was being responsible, grounded, focused on what actually mattered. Adult. I was absent from my own life, and I had wrapped that absence in language that made it sound like a virtue. The gym came first. I went back on a Tuesday, not a Monday. Starting on Mondays has always felt like performance to me, like you're announcing something rather than doing it. Tuesdays feel honest. I went early, before work, and I was bad at it in a way that would have embarrassed me a year earlier. Out of breath faster than I should have been, lifting lighter than I used to. Every muscle reminding me of the months of absence in loud, specific terms. I didn't care. I went back Thursday, then the following Tuesday, then Thursday again. Then I was going 4 days a week, then 5. Not because I had set that as a target, but because I started sleeping better, and the better sleep made me want to move, and the movement made me sleep better, and the whole thing became its own self-reinforcing loop. I also registered for a professional certification course, operations management, something my company had offered to subsidize twice, and I had let both offers expire because I could never find a compelling enough reason to prioritize it. I found the website, filled in the form, entered my payment information, and submitted it on a Wednesday night while eating leftover rice at my kitchen table. It felt like nothing significant. It was the second most important thing I did after walking out that door. Here's what nobody tells you about rebuilding yourself from the inside. The first month, you feel nothing dramatically different. You just feel like someone doing more things while being tired more often. You wake up early and feel the effort of it. You study after work when your brain is ready to stop for the day. You go to the gym when it would be easier to not. The effort is real. The tiredness is real. And there is no visible payoff yet. No transformation you can see in the mirror, no dramatic shift in your circumstances, no evidence that it's going anywhere. What's happening is invisible. Underneath the surface, somewhere below the level of conscious perception, something is being reconstructed. Not a new person, a recovered one. A recalibration, like a compass that has been pointing slightly wrong for a long time, slowly, imperceptibly finding its way back to magnetic north. The first sign I noticed wasn't physical and it wasn't professional. It was that I started talking more. I had been in operational meetings at work for months, years, if I'm being honest, where I said maybe 3 sentences and let the rest of the room lead without contributing. Not because I had nothing to add. I had things to add constantly. Observations, concerns, ideas I had been quietly accumulating and filing away. But I had gotten into the habit, inside the relationship, of monitoring myself before I spoke, of calculating whether what I was about to say would land wrong, of preemptively minimizing my own presence. And that habit had spread without my noticing. It had contaminated every area of my life. Then one morning, in a Tuesday operations meeting, I just stopped doing that. I flagged an inefficiency I had noticed in our receiving workflow. Not dramatically, not as a formal presentation. Just said it plainly, in a normal voice. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's the downstream effect. Here's what I think we could try instead. 3 heads turned. My manager looked up from his notes. I kept going. After the meeting, a colleague came and found me at my desk. Someone I had barely spoken to in months. He said, "That was a good catch. Why haven't you mentioned it before?" I didn't have a good answer for that, but I started paying attention to the question. I had been keeping a running mental list, not written down anywhere, just accumulated, of things I had noticed at work and never raised. Systems issues, workflow gaps, small inefficiencies I had clocked over months and quietly filed away because it never felt like the right moment, or because I had simply become the kind of person who noticed things and didn't speak. I started raising them, one at a time, carefully, with specific data when I had it, and specific suggestions rather than vague complaints. I wasn't going around criticizing everything. I was identifying problems and showing up with the beginnings of solutions. That's a different thing. People respond differently to those two postures. By the end of my 5th week back at the gym, my manager asked me to stay behind after a morning meeting. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Curious, like he was trying to locate something. Something's different about you lately, he said. I don't know how to name it exactly. You seem switched on. I'm paying attention, I said. He nodded slowly, like that was the right answer. Keep doing that. I left his office and went back to my desk and sat with that for a moment. He wasn't complimenting me on something new. He wasn't praising extraordinary ability or unusual talent. He was simply observing that I was present, actually present, contributing, engaged with what was in front of me rather than just passing through it. And the strange thing, the humbling thing, was that this capacity had always been there. It had never gone anywhere. I had just turned it off, gradually, across 2 years of learning to minimize myself, and I had forgotten where the switch was. Around the 3-month mark, something quietly important changed. I stopped thinking about her every day, not as a sudden absence. Gradually, like a radio signal fading as you drive away from the station, the sound getting softer across weeks until you notice, one afternoon, that you haven't heard it in a while. Some mornings still pulled at something. A specific quality of early weekend light. A song from someone else's window. The smell of a particular coffee. Those things would pull me back briefly into the texture of those 2 years, and I would sit with the feeling for a minute rather than rushing past it. But the feeling had changed. It wasn't pain anymore. It was more like the specific calm that comes from finally understanding something that had confused you for a long time. The quiet satisfaction of solved arithmetic. The peace of knowing the shape of something clearly. I had lunch with Felix around this time. A friend I had genuinely neglected for the better part of a year and a half. Someone who had known me since university and had received very little of my attention for far too long. We met at a restaurant near his office, and he spent the first 20 minutes looking at me with his head tilted at a slight angle. The way people do when they're seeing something they haven't quite identified yet. Okay, he said finally. What happened to you? I gave him the short version. He was quiet for a moment after. Then, she said you were replaceable. Her exact words. And you just agreed with her. Seemed honest at the time. He laughed, not mocking, more like something had surprised a laugh out of him. And that was the thing that fixed you. Not the agreement, I said. What I did after it. He raised his glass across the table. Then she did you the biggest favor of your life without knowing it. I thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon. And several times after that. The certification finished at the end of month 4. High distinction. Highest score in my cohort. I found that out from the results email on a Thursday morning and sat with it for a while before it fully settled in. I had spent 2 years being described in the most neutral possible terms. Reliable. Steady. Does his job. Doesn't cause trouble. The kind of professional descriptor that says nothing and commits to nothing. Now I was being ranked against a cohort of professionals from across multiple industries, and I was at the top of it. I had to sit with that. It didn't fit the story I had been told, or more accurately, the story I had slowly allowed other people to tell about me until I had accepted it as true. I applied for a promotion the same week. No announcement. No consultation. No asking anyone's opinion about whether it was too soon or too ambitious or whether I should wait for a better moment. I wrote the application on a Sunday morning while my coffee went cold, attached the certification, outlined 3 specific improvements I had designed and implemented in my division over the prior 4 months with their measurable outcomes, and submitted it. Then I went to the gym and spent 0 mental energy thinking about it. That was new behavior. The old version of me would have spent the next 2 weeks analyzing every interaction with my manager for hidden evidence of what they thought. Would have second-guessed every word of the application. Would have found a reason to believe it was probably a mistake to have sent it at all. Instead, I did the work and let it be what it was. I should tell you something I found out around this time. About a month after we ended, she had started seeing someone new. I heard this through the slow osmosis of overlapping social circles. Not gossip exactly, just information traveling the path of least resistance between people who knew both of us. The description I received was something like, pretty flashy, deliberate looking, drove a nice car, posted frequently online. The type who creates a strong first impression from a distance. I took a moment to examine my own reaction honestly when I heard that. There was a small flinch. I won't pretend there wasn't. But underneath the flinch, when I looked further, nothing. No urgency to compare. No instinct to go look him up and assess myself against him. No need to run the calculation of where I stood. I noticed that absence more than I noticed the flinch itself. A few months earlier, that same information might have sent me somewhere dark. Would have had me fixating on the comparison, trying to figure out what it said about me, what I had failed to be, what she had wanted that I hadn't provided. Instead, I filed it away and went back to what I'd been doing before I heard it. I was more interested in my own direction than in where I stood relative to someone else. That was genuinely new territory for me. Month 5. I got the promotion. Not the exact role I had applied for. They created a slightly different position, new title, broader scope, a meaningful increase in salary. My manager called me in on a Friday afternoon and walked me through it, and I sat in that chair and listened to him describe the reasoning. What he described was not the person I remembered being 6 months earlier. He talked about initiative, about solving problems before being asked. He mentioned, specifically, that 3 separate colleagues had independently said something to leadership about my contributions being undervalued. He outlined the workflow improvements I had designed and their measurable impact on throughput. He said the word leadership 3 times in connection with how I had been operating. I accepted, thanked him, shook his hand, walked back to my desk, and sent Felix a single line. Got promoted. His response came back inside 90 seconds. Called it. Dinner's on you. Somewhere in month 5, the gym had become something I looked forward to. It had stopped being discipline and become something more like a return. Coming home to a self I recognized. The tiredness afterward was the good kind, productive, earned, the satisfying soreness of a body being used for what it was built for. I had put on muscle I hadn't realized I'd lost. Not dramatically, not in the way that announces itself. But I felt different in my own skin, more present in it. Like I had moved back into a house I had been absent to renting for too long. My energy had changed in quality, not just quantity. It was quieter and more consistent. Not the caffeinated, faintly anxious energy I had been running on for 2 years, always slightly braced, always subtly monitoring for the next thing I would need to manage. This was steadier. The kind that doesn't spike and crash, but just persists across a full day and into the evening. I had started cooking properly again. Not elaborate food, nothing worth photographing. Just real meals, made with actual ingredients, in my own kitchen, for no reason except that I had stopped using food as something to minimize effort around. In the relationship, I had defaulted to whatever required the fewest decisions, because my decision-making bandwidth had been so thoroughly spoken for by other things. Now I actually stood at my stove and paid attention to what I was making. Small, but compound. The small things always compound. There was another thing I started doing around this time that I almost feel embarrassed to mention because it sounds too simple. I started writing things down. Not a journal in any formal sense. Not with any plan. Just a notebook I kept on my desk, and when I had a thought worth keeping, an observation about work, an idea I didn't want to lose, something I had noticed about my own behavior, I wrote it down. 5 minutes, sometimes less. Just the act of taking something internal and making it external. Of treating my own thoughts like things worth capturing. I had spent 2 years living so much in reaction that I had stopped trusting my own interior. Stopped believing my read on things was worth anything. When you live with someone who consistently tells you that your observations are wrong, your instincts are off, your sense of things is unreliable, even subtly, even without saying it in those exact words, you start to doubt the machinery of your own judgment. Writing things down helped rebuild trust in that machinery. And some of the things I wrote down, when I went back and looked at them weeks later, turned out to be right. Turned out to be sharper than I had given myself credit for in the moment. Turned out to be exactly the kind of observation that, if I had voiced it in a meeting or brought it to a decision, would have been the right move. That was its own kind of rebuilding. Quiet. Internal. Not visible to anyone. But absolutely real. I want to tell you something about the specific kind of loneliness that lives inside a relationship that isn't working. It's different from the loneliness of being alone. Being alone has a clean quality. You know what it is. You can name it. You can act on it. You can call someone, go somewhere, reach toward people. The loneliness of being with someone who doesn't really see you is harder to name and harder to act on. Because from the outside, you're not alone. You have a relationship. You have a person. You share space and meals and a version of a life. And when you feel that hollow ache in the middle of all of it, you can't explain it easily. You just feel something like vague wrongness. Like static on a frequency that should be clear. I had been carrying that specific loneliness for the better part of the 2nd year of the relationship. I hadn't named it. I hadn't examined it directly, because examining it directly would have meant acknowledging what we had wasn't what I had been telling myself it was. The thing about finally walking away, even in the difficult early weeks, was that the loneliness became clean again. It had a shape. It was just ordinary missing. Missing someone. Missing the familiar shape of a routine. Missing the version of things that the early days had promised. That kind of loneliness you can move through. And on the other side of it, eventually, there was just space. Clear space. Room to figure out what you actually wanted. Room to be lonely in the productive sense. The sense that makes you reach toward real connection rather than settle for a substitute. That space was one of the best things she accidentally gave me. Felix brought me back into a social circle I had let lapse. Friends of his, friends of friends. That loose kind of collective that forms in your late 20s around overlapping interests and shared scheduling. Hiking, dinners, trivia, someone's apartment on a Friday night with no particular agenda. The kind of social gathering where you're not being evaluated and nothing is expected, and the baseline assumption is just that everyone is glad everyone else showed up. I had forgotten what that felt like. I had spent 2 years in a relationship where my presence was, at best, tolerated. Where I existed in the space as someone allowed to be there rather than someone wanted there. And I hadn't fully registered until it was gone and replaced by something different. How slowly that drains something from you. How quietly it empties out the part of you that believes you're worth spending time with. Being around people who lit up when you walked in, who genuinely wanted you at the table, who laughed at your observations, who texted you to invite you to things rather than waiting to see if you'd show up, it rebuilds something. Something that had been depleted without my consciously knowing it. I had been lonely inside that relationship in a way I had never fully let myself name while I was in it. Coming out of it, being around these people, I started to understand how lonely I had actually been. Month 6. She reached out. A Saturday afternoon. I was at Felix's, 3 of us watching a match, easy afternoon, nobody particularly invested in their phones. My screen lit up with her name. Short message. Nothing dramatic. Hey, how are you doing? I looked at it. I showed it to Felix without comment. He read it, looked at me, waited. What are you going to do? He said. I thought about it genuinely. Not from ego or strategy. Not from the old instinct to jump at any opening. The instinct that would have immediately started constructing a future around it. I thought about what I actually wanted. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I put the phone face down and went back to the match. I thought about it the rest of that day and into the next. Not anxiously, just honestly. What did I want? What would responding in the way she was implicitly asking for look like in 3 months? In 6? Who would I be at the end of that story? By Monday, I had a clear enough answer. I responded to her. Short. Not cold, just settled. Doing well. Hope you are too. She came back quickly. I watched the dots appear. Disappear. Appear again. Disappear. You seem different. People have mentioned it. I held that for a moment. The specific strangeness of being told you've changed by the person who told you you'd never be anything worth becoming. I probably am, I typed. A longer pause this time. Can we talk sometime? Properly. I sat with that question. I turned it over carefully. I knew what properly meant. It was an open door. At minimum, the possibility of one. She was asking whether there was something still worth returning to. Whether the verdict had been premature. And I thought about the version of me that would have said yes without hesitation. Who would have read that message as the turning point, the moment of recognition, the reconciliation, the proof that none of it had been wasted. I knew that version of me. He would have been wrong. I don't think so, I wrote. But genuinely, take care of yourself. I meant it. No performance. No irony. I sent it, put the phone down, and went to cook dinner. I didn't spend a moment second-guessing it. There's a moment, not a single moment, more of a long, slow arrival, where you stop measuring yourself by what someone else said about you, where the external verdict finally loses jurisdiction over your interior life. For the first few months, her words had been the engine. Not consciously, not as a deliberate strategy, but in some real and honest sense, what was driving me was the need to disprove her, to become the opposite of what she had called me, to turn her verdict wrong. Engines change. They have to, because prove her wrong has a ceiling built into it. Once you've disproven her, once you're clearly past the low version of yourself she had decided was your ceiling, what's left? You're still building towards someone else's definition of you, just in reverse. You're still letting her be the reference point. The shift happened somewhere around month 5. Gradual, like most things that matter. I stopped wanting to disprove her. I started wanting things for myself for their own sake, not in reaction to anything, not in response to anyone. I wanted to be good at my job because the work was genuinely interesting and the contribution felt real. I wanted to be in good shape because it made me feel like myself, inhabited, capable, present. I wanted close friendships because I had let mine hollow out over 2 years, and I missed the specific texture of being known by people who had chosen to know you. None of that had anything to do with her anymore. That was the real shift. Not the title, not the gym, not any external outcome. The real shift was that I became the purpose of my own life again. I stopped being a character in her story, even the revised, retaliatory version of her story, and started being the author of my own. That was when I knew I was actually okay. Felix told me about the run-in. He hadn't planned for it. It was at a mutual friends gathering, the kind of event where the guest list overlaps without anyone comparing notes, where you show up and find your social circles have converged unexpectedly. He hadn't told me she might be there because he genuinely hadn't known until he arrived. He called me that evening. She saw some photos of you, he said, on someone else's phone, from the hiking trip last month. I waited. She went very quiet when she saw them, and then she asked me how you were doing. What did you say? I said you were doing really well. Better than I've seen you in years, honestly. A beat. She asked if you were seeing anyone. And I told her I didn't know and that it probably wasn't my place to say either way. Good answer. He paused, choosing his words. She looked thoughtful, not in a good way. The way you look thoughtful when you're doing mental arithmetic and the numbers aren't coming out the way you hoped. I thought about that for a while after we hung up. I had expected, if this moment ever came, to feel something triumphant. The vindication you imagine in quiet moments early in the rebuilding, when you're not sure yet if it's going anywhere. The imagined scene where she sees who you've become and has to sit with what she said. Instead, I felt something quieter, settled, like the period at the end of a sentence. Not dramatic, just complete. I heard later that things hadn't worked out between her and the person she'd started seeing. I heard it the same way I'd heard about him, through the slow current of overlapping social geography. Passed along without agenda, the way things are. I want to be clear about something because it matters. Her unhappiness was not the point. The point had never been the comparison. The point had never been the moment where the scales tip visibly in your favor and you feel the satisfaction of it. I had imagined that feeling in the early weeks, when I was still running on wounded pride and the need to disprove something. But it had faded with everything else that was no longer about her. The point was my life. Just my life. The fact that I had been living it at about a third of my actual capacity for 2 years and had finally, by accident or by grace, found a reason to stop. Her situation, whatever it was, however it was going, existed completely separately from that project. I thought about it briefly when I heard it. Set it down. Moved on. 8 months after I walked out of her apartment. New title. A broader scope of work. A team of 3 people who partially reported to me. A salary I hadn't been earning before and wouldn't have been offered 6 months earlier. A body that felt inhabited again. A social life that had grown from almost nothing into something I actively looked forward to. A calendar full of things I had chosen for reasons I could actually name. I had a phone call with my brother, who lives overseas. We talked for a long time, the kind of call that happens maybe once a month and covers more ground than it seems like it should. Toward the end of it, he said something that stayed with me. You sound different. Different how? I asked. He was quiet for a moment, working on the right word. Lighter, he said finally. Like something that used to sit on you just isn't sitting on you anymore. We said goodbye, and I stood in my kitchen for a while afterward with that. He had known me for my entire life. He had known me before her, during her, and now after. He was not describing the promotion or the body or any specific external change. He was describing a weight that had lifted. The specific gravitational relief of no longer carrying a verdict about yourself that someone else had written. I want to say something about the phrase, nothing special, because I have had months now to sit with it, and I have arrived at somewhere specific about what it actually means and what it doesn't. When she said it, she was treating special like a fixed quantity, a permanent characteristic, something you carry or you don't, something established at birth or early on and thereafter unchangeable. A reading on a scale that stays constant regardless of what you do. That's not how it works. Whatever special actually means, and I'm not even sure that's the right word, it isn't a trait. It's an output. It is the accumulated result of choices made and sustained over time. It's what emerges when you decide to do the harder thing consistently, when you stay in the room with the difficult problem, When you build something incrementally across weeks and months when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. I was nothing special that night, she said it. Not because I was incapable of being anything. I was nothing special because I had stopped doing the things that made me feel like myself. I had let the relationship consume the energy that was supposed to go toward my own growth. I had made the trade of growth for comfort, and then slowly the comfort had soured, and I had been left with nothing. Not growth, not comfort, not myself. The moment I walked out, the moment I made one decision and then another, and kept going when it was easier to stop, the accumulation began. Nobody saw it at first. There was no audience for the first months. No recognition for the early weeks when I was just tired and uncertain and rebuilding something I couldn't yet see the full shape of. There was just me and the question I had asked myself lying in the dark. What would the opposite of this look like? And then the quiet, daily work of finding out. I'm not going to tell you this is a story about becoming someone unrecognizable. I didn't reinvent myself from the ground up. I didn't start a company. I didn't win anything public or become anyone famous or transform into someone who bore no resemblance to who I had been. I became a clearer version of something I had always been capable of. A recovered version. The version that had existed before 2 years of shrinking inside something that didn't fit. That's all it was. And it turns out that's more than enough. More than enough to change what your days feel like, how you carry yourself in a room, how you speak in a meeting, how you relate to the people around you, what kinds of opportunities arrive, and which ones stop coming. There is something I want to say to anyone who has heard a version of what she said to me. Not necessarily those exact words. Maybe it was something quieter. Maybe it was never said out loud at all. Maybe it was just a look, a tone, a pattern of small dismissals that accumulated into a verdict over time. Maybe it was someone who was supposed to be in your corner, who gradually made you feel like being in your own corner was arrogance. Those verdicts feel permanent in a way that almost nothing else does. They get inside the part of you that decides what you're worth trying for. They make you audit yourself before you speak. They make you small in rooms you were never supposed to be small in. But here's what I know for certain after everything that happened. The verdict is not the truth. The verdict is a data point about where you were at one specific moment, as seen through one specific pair of eyes, in a relationship that had its own damage and its own limitations. It is not a permanent reading of your ceiling. You are not a fixed quantity. You are a direction, and direction, chosen clearly, followed consistently, protected even when nothing is guaranteed, produces things that no one can revoke. Not the person who dismissed you, not the circumstances that made you small, not even the version of yourself you were when you heard the words and, just for a second, believed them. What I became in those 8 months was not revenge. It was not proof. It was just the natural result of finally deciding to move. When you decide to move, really decide, not as a performance, not as a reaction, but as a genuine commitment to the direction of your own life, you become someone different. Not overnight, not dramatically, but unmistakably. They don't need you to be extraordinary. They just need you to be showing up, to be building something, to be honestly and consistently moving. That's it. And the people who looked at you at your lowest, at your smallest, at the moment you had strayed furthest from yourself, and decided that that moment was your permanent ceiling, they feel it too. They feel it from a distance, from gatherings neither of you planned, from photographs on other people's phones. And they sit with whatever that feeling is, privately, in a moment nobody else has access to. That's not revenge. I need to be clear about that. That's not the point. It was never the point. That's just the natural consequence of someone deciding you were finished before you were done becoming. The last time I really sat with what she said, turned it over slowly and with my full attention, I was at my desk on a Wednesday morning. Early, before most people had come in. The building had that specific, belonging quality that only exists before the institution fills up with itself. I had a coffee. I had a project I was genuinely excited about. I had plans with Felix that evening and a trip I was organizing for the following month. I had, without specifically setting out to build it, a life that felt unmistakably mine. And the words came back. Nothing special, easily replaceable, not with weight this time, not with pain, almost with a quiet kind of gratitude. The feeling you have for a hard thing that made you better, not because it was kind, but because it was clarifying. I thought, thank you, not sarcastically, not as a performance, genuinely, because those words had done something that years of comfort never had and probably never would have. They had shown me exactly where I was standing. They had named the problem with absolute clarity, even if the intent was to dismiss rather than illuminate. They had stripped away the comfortable story I had been telling myself about being fine, about coasting being the same as living, about small and safe being the same as present. They had woken me up, and everything that came after, every early morning, every choice to stay in when quitting was available, every moment I chose direction over comfort, all of it traces back to a woman putting down her phone and delivering a verdict she intended as a dismissal. She thought she was closing a door. She cracked one open. She watched from a distance as I became everything she said I wasn't. And I wasn't even watching her watch. I was already somewhere else. Already on to the next thing. Already becoming. The only people who believe you're replaceable are the ones who stopped looking at you too early.